And we're going to be talking about and around his recently published autobiography, The Accidental Footballer. And I thought I'd start, Pat, with the title, The Accidental Footballer. In what way are you accidental?
Well, the sadness of it is, if you don't like my book, blame me, because I've written every word of it, right? So I didn't get it ghosted. However, I can't claim the title because the chap who was looking at the editing afterwards, just checking over it, he came up with the title. But it's very fitting, and I'm really pleased with it, because at no point in my life did I ever plan to be a professional footballer. In fact, one of the lines I tend to use is, I tried very hard not to be a professional footballer and failed, which is an unusual situation, I think, for most professional footballers who have, in the end, what was a 19-year career. But I played football for the pure love and joy of it. And when I was learning as a kid and as a youth player and with my dad, I was just doing it because I loved doing it. I didn't want to particularly go and make a living out of it. In fact, I feared making a living out of it would take the joy away from it, because many jobs happen. That happens in many jobs, and maybe I was quite old for my young years and I understood that. So I tried hard to. I went in. I started doing a degree. I was doing other things, but the football just kept on grabbing me back in, and eventually I took a chance after turning Chelsea down for an entire year. I said, no, I want to keep on doing my degree, which means it's not a made up line about being an accidental footballer. I tried really hard not to do it as a profession. But I was fortunate, it just kept on going well. And it turned out that accident became a very happy accident for me, because the enjoyable times I had during football as an outsider, and that's maybe one of the joys of this book. There have been many books written by insiders inside football, but I'm very much an outsider who was inside the sport, and it gives you a very different perspective, because things that they all think are normal, I realise the rest of us, and I mean all of us here that are listening, it's weird. And that was one of the great joys of writing the book, that I could hopefully try to bring that out.
When I was a kid, there was, in my local library, I don't think there were any football books. There were lots of books about cricket. People made lots of claims about why cricket was such a literate sport and all of that stuff. These days, it's sometimes really hard to escape the amount of words around football. What changed, and in what ways was that both useful to you, but also almost a problem, something that you wanted to circumvent? What are the kind of almost the new cliches that have emerged around football writing?
May I say, that's a fabulous question. And the reason being is, I came from a different angle. I was interested in literature. So when I was younger, I ate up all the classics, be they French, German, Russian, whatever, English, of course. But I also loved some of the newer writers, and certainly the new journalists were fantastic writers, and some of them wrote about sport. Hunter S. Thompson would sometimes write about sport, and if, all apart from Truman Capote, the rest of them all did have a go at sport, but they didn't attack it as a sports journalist. They looked at it from a different angle, because the sports journalism that we read, we've all read it. We know the phrases. We know how people are saying it. We know the expected journey. We know the norms. I'm bored senseless with all of them. Hence, I'm coming from a completely different angle. And I don't just look at sports journalism. I certainly don't look a great deal at sports journalism when I started my writing. I think writing's just writing, and if you want to get a message across, the idea of the ball rippled against a wet net and I felt great sort of stuff. Yeah, very good, but I've read that before. Who cares? I'm going to tell you other things that you might not have seen. So, I mean, I played at Chelsea for a wee period of time, and we had a big blonde centre forward who played for England. And, he's mentioned in the book, and there's the odd story about him, but it's more about his gambling addiction and the troubles that then became bigger in sport after that. But I spent more time talking about a chap called John McNaught, who only played half a dozen games. but he was a much more interesting story. I love the stories of very unusual people, and still do, within, you know, whatever genre it is, but within that sport, they do pop up. And sometimes the other things, that the clashes that you get. I mean, there is, you may or may not come onto it later, but I had a night out with the singer Morrissey. I spent an evening, and it's an extraordinary story, and it's half a chapter, but it's the strangeness. Now, I could have put lots of other stories about people like that in the book, but it was just to encapsulate that my two different worlds, sometimes three or four different worlds, now and again they crash together. And it's those crashes that I find interesting, because when that sort of, almost like a collider, you know, like a, I'm not going to say it's a hadron collider, but when a collider happens, you don't know what's going to splash off. And I was always interested in that in my life, even before I wrote. So that's many of the sort of things that I was going towards. So when people ask me about sports journalism, yes, I'm talking about a sport. I'll be honest with you, I'm not convinced you need to be that into sport to read this book.
Yeah. Can you tell, for it's going to be in a couple of years, nearly 20 years since John Peel has died. And for many people, he is one of the kind of architects of post-war Britain, and who defined and kind of extended our cultural imaginations in ways that sometimes we're still living through. You, at the time that you were kind of gracing Stamford Bridge, were working for free for John Peel late in the evening. Could you say who he was and kind of why he's also a big figure in The Accidental Footballer?
Well, he is a big figure because he was, before I went to London, I'd never met John Peel. I used to listen to his radio show every night. And he promoted young, interesting, unusual bands that, in the end, almost any great musician stroke band who has got a soul came through John Peel's show. And he discovered a vast, vast number of them. And he was the first person to bring them to the populace. And those of us who love music, we would listen to him, you know, absolutely religiously every night. And all through my late teens, I would do that. And when I sang for Chelsea going down in the train, if I had one dream that I had, it wasn't scoring a diving header against Arsenal for Chelsea down at Stamford Bridge, although I did do that in the end. It was, I might meet John Peel at a gig one night, and I might say hello. Anyway, I eventually, when I went down, and after a while, a meeting was arranged by myself because I was interviewing him for a magazine that I was writing for at the time. And we met up, and we immediately became great friends. There was reasons for it. We had a number of things in common. He loved football. I loved football. He loved music. I loved music. But we were both very much outsiders in our own industries. But we were also in those industries because we loved those industries, not because we wanted to make money, not because we wanted to be famous. In fact, the fame and celebrity thing, we were both very, very wary of. And John and I have stayed that way all our lives. So I would go in and meet up with John after a few months of knowing him. He would just say, "Do you want to come into the show tonight?" So they were doing the show, and sometimes it'd be going out in the World Service. Usually it was going out in Radio 1 at night. And he would play his latest Belgian madness, or something from Eastern Europe that was mad noise, or something German, or something from anywhere in the world, or some great new punky band. And I would write down all the notes so that they could get paid their 50p or whatever it was, these artists, because you had to write down the notes so they wouldn't get paid. But the joy was just being with John and talking about life, talking about people, talking about music, talking about football, talking about anything. And we just had so much in common. And that kept on all the way through our lives. And there was a moment, a wonderful moment, when I left Chelsea and went to Everton. And we got to the FA Cup final. And I'm playing for Everton against Liverpool. And John's a Liverpool fan. And I'll get him tickets for the game. And he turned up head to toe in red. I said, "I got you tickets. I'm blue. I'm Everton." But he was a red, and he sat in the Everton end, head to toe red. And because he was John Peel, everyone loved him, was kind to him.